This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international programme of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and today I'm joined by Lee Hutchison. Hi Lee, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me back.
Always a pleasure, Lee. You ready for a deep dive tonight?
Yeah, I've got my little swim shorts on. I'm good to go. Or should I say my little cap? I think it's more appropriate to probably have a nice cap and sort of a nice thick jacket, actually.
Yeah. Well, you might need more than that. You might need some scuba gear or, even something kind of heavier than that. We are looking today at a classic of watery, I was going to say nautical literature. I don't know if it quite counts as nautical because it's under the water rather than on the water. But we're talking about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the 1870 novel by Jules Verne, which crops up in a couple of episodes of Voyager, is mentioned, name-checked. Well, actually, name-checked twice, effectively. Name-checked in Year of Hell, which is what we're going to kind of mainly be focusing on because that's the episode that probably really draws from this story the most. But name-checked as well in the underwatery episode 30 Days, where we have Tom Paris with his love of all things seafaring and indeed including things faring under the sea. It's a wonderful novel. I don't know about you. I mean, I read this when I was a kid and was kind of transfixed by it, like Tom Paris was. My son has listened to at least some of the audio version, and it's a bit of a grown-up book for him, I suppose, but he's just obsessed with submarines and absolutely thrilled by the whole thing. I think particularly the idea of submarines that ram ships and make them sink. There's something quite thrilling about that somehow to children of all ages.
I'm sure he'll love Star Trek Nemesis then.
We'll have to wait and see. Yeah, he did actually. Funnily enough, I did because I had to watch 30 Days in preparation for this, and I had it on, and he sort of wandered over, and he was kind of looking over my shoulder at my iPad. So I said, "Oh, do you want to watch it with me?" And he sat through. I think it's the first time he's actually sat through a whole Star Trek episode. We watched The Voyage Home a few weeks ago, and he enjoyed that again because he loves whales, and there was a kind of going for a watery theme, I suppose. I don't know. Maybe he might enjoy like the opening section of Into Darkness as well, and anything that has a kind of underwater theme. But he really enjoyed it. I love that episode too. But yeah. Nemesis, I'm not so sure. But yeah, you're right. There's definitely a kind of parallel there with this idea of, using your ship as a battering ram, attaining ramming speed as Worf has it in First Contact.
I think there's something to be said about like kids and something like 30 Days where I think what it was like late 98. So I think by the time it came to the UK, I would have been about 11, 12, something like that. And like, I remember just being always thinking about the idea of like, I would like to see the Enterprise go underwater or like it could easily do that. It's got shields. I think there's something that just like plays to that little boyish, childish element where it's kind of like, spaceship goes into the sea, and there's just something quite different and exciting about that, and almost surprises you it took so long for Star Trek to do something like that over like 500 odd episodes.
It's true, actually, because obviously there are a lot of parallels between submarines and spaceships. I mean, going all the way back to the original series, we had Balance of Terror. It was basically a kind of submarine drama on the Enterprise. Again, with Wrath of Khan, I think there's a lot of kind of submarine vibes there. And by the time they got to Enterprise, of course, they were touring nuclear submarines to get kind of inspiration for production design. So elements like the low ceilings, the bits sticking out that you had to kind of dodge so you didn't knock yourself out. Things like that were kind of taken directly from real life submarines. And there is obviously a kind of basic parallel between a vessel in space, which is an environment that if either it comes into the ship or you go out into it, is essentially going to kill you. You know, there's no air to breathe. It's a hostile alien environment, isn't it? And being underwater, which is pretty much the same. You know, you're going to drown, you're going to suffocate, and you're also going to be subjected to pressure that is very dangerous in a similar way, you know, that you have in space. So I think there are these kind of parallels between these two environments. Funnily enough, I heard an interview on the radio a few weeks ago with Heidi Thomas, the screenwriter who writes Call the Midwife. And I don't know why they ended up talking about Star Trek. And she was saying, you know, her brother watched Star Trek or something when she was a kid. And she said for years, because she never really watched it, this would be the original series, it was sort of on in the background, she believed it was set on a submarine. She hadn't picked up that it was set in space somehow. And you can sort of see how the whole style of the drama is very applicable. And certainly the Nautilus in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, I think, has features in common with a lot of the ships we see in Star Trek. It's not just a kind of military vessel, it's a kind of luxury vessel. It has a library, it has, you know, music on board, it has kind of lavish feasts. It's sort of it's very much the kind of Enterprise D or the Voyager of the Star Trek universe somehow.
Yeah, it always seems to be that by and large Star Trek seems to get pulled between that. Like it's the luxury liner in space. You think of the Enterprise, Voyager, and then you have that kind of Nicholas Meyer sort of like, it's the naval style thing where it really leans into that. And then a kind of Enterprise maybe kind of takes that a little bit further. And then, you know, you think of some of the episodes where I always have a thing for Star Trek when it goes a bit nautical, a bit naval, where I think of an episode I recently finished a Deep Space Nine rewatch, and I just absolutely love, I think it's For the Uniform, where the Defiant's slightly damaged, and like you just see the ship basically turn into this kind of naval, submarine style ship where everyone's kind of communicating. It's between all the different levels. You get a kind of a really interesting insight into Star Trek that way, and you think of all the hundreds of episodes and movies, how very few of them seem to lean into that kind of, you know, full-handedly, like it does with, say, Star Trek 2 in particular, a bit of 6, and then some of the episodes we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. That episode For the Uniform, I think it's also a rare example where you kind of get some kind of understanding of why there are so many people on these starships, at least in that instance, because you've got messages being conveyed back and forth and the idea that everyone has to be sort of coordinated somehow. Whereas a lot of the time in Star Trek, it kind of feels really, it could almost be like a school bus or a people mover or something. You know, there's a handful of people on the bridge and we don't really know what anyone else is doing. But, you know, there's 1,000 odd people on the Enterprise D. Who knows how many of them are actually actively involved in anything that's happening while the ship is kind of going around. But episodes like that, it kind of makes you a little bit more aware of that, I suppose, in the way that you would be, you know, on a sailing vessel. It's very obvious because you've got, I don't know, people going up the rigging, pulling on ropes, you know, their jobs are very clear and sort of visible, I suppose. Whereas with these starships, we're sort of supposed to understand, I suppose, every time, you know, Worf or whoever fires a torpedo, are we meant to imagine someone is loading that into a tube like we see at other moments? I mean, Star Trek obviously is not necessarily consistent about these things. You're right. Nicholas Meyer obviously leans into the kind of seafaring element. Hence, we do get scenes of like torpedoes being loaded into tubes and things like that. A lot of Star Trek doesn't really go there. Is not really interested in this stuff. And, you know, I guess at the other extreme, you get things like in the Kelvin films, the kind of crazy engineering set that, you know, is basically a brewery. It looks wildly oversized. On Discovery, you get these kind of turbo shafts that seem to be about 5 times as big as the ship itself. You get all these kind of bizarre issues around, I suppose, around space and scale. But I think it's an interesting one thinking about a submarine, because the submarine is somewhat more cramped than most of the starships that we're familiar with. On the other hand, the Nautilus in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is supposed to be a sort of surprisingly large submarine. I mean, I don't know if I don't think there were even other submarines to compare it to, but we get the sense that it's not a kind of cramped, confined environment so much. It's built in as I say, a kind of almost palatial way. And certainly in the very popular Disney movie, I would say one of the great strengths of that movie is the production design. I don't know if you've seen that 1960s film. I mean, the design of the Nautilus, which is not at all how I imagined it when I first read the book, absolutely gorgeous though. And the design of, Nemo's room with his organ and all his, this sense, in both Year of Hell and in 20,000 Leagues, there's a sense that this ship is a museum as much as anything else. I mean, in 20,000 Leagues, Aronnax, the kind of narrator character, marvels over many of the things that Nemo has collected over the years, whether it's kind of jewels and riches or whether it's kind of zoological wonders that he's gathered in the ocean. Aronnax in Year of Hell says to Chakotay, I think this ship is as much a museum as anything else, and again, we know that he's been gathering these things from these civilizations he's been destroying. He's been, keeping the finest wine of some, group of people that he's basically, magicked out of existence so they don't exist anymore. So there's this weird sense of, I don't know, I suppose, is there something kind of almost decadent about that? Is there something almost kind of more sinister about this idea of this kind of collector, this sort of makes you think of the most toys, thinking of Star Trek, someone who's kind of very into having all these things, but very indifferent to human suffering, to the kind of things that we might think are really important.
I think it was interesting to pick up one thing I in my research, and this kind of blew my little mind, was like, there was an interview, well, it was more of a fact than anything. Like John Holland, who built the first sort of US Navy submarine, said like the inspiration came from reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And I always just assumed like the origin of like the submarine predated even kind of the books. But for me, I almost don't think of it as sinister. I think of another show, something like kind of Ronald D. Moore's Battlestar Galactica, where the ship was a museum, very much kind of this, submarine style ship as well. But yes, it became a museum. It had kind of, you had your, I forget the name of the little ships and stuff like they had, but everything was kind of put into sort of museums, and then it became an active ship again. But it became a lived-in ship in terms of, after they had this disaster, they customized it, they turned it into little kind of memorials. It became what they needed to become. Whereas you always think of something like Star Trek Voyager, for example, where it does kind of lean into some of this 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea stuff a bit more than any of the other shows. And it was always very much a sterile ship. And it was, you think of it like it's gone 70,000 light years from home, but apart from perhaps like building the stellar cartography area, turning the captain's, mess into the galley and so on, it kind of stayed as a very polished ship, very much straight off the line. Even when it was incredibly damaged, it was always fine the next day. Whereas I always found it interesting where when the show would perhaps something like would lean into kind of treating it like a museum and so on. And I think, to go back to Ronald D. Moore, when he came on for his brief stint on Voyager, there was a really good interview with him after he left the show, quite angry, sharing his frustrations with the franchise in general, having gone from something like Deep Space Nine, which was so positive, to Voyager. And he was like, why would you not make the ship incredibly personalized? Why would you, the idea that the ship would stay static is completely false, that they should be building up these things, tribute to the crew members that they've lost, the journey they're going on to, making things a bit more kind of homely, whereas they just kept it to that regimented design. I always think of it not as something terrifying or scary, but something that makes it feel like a place to live. And, obviously they're more sticking to kind of rules and the Prime Directive right there, but I miss that kind of customization. I think that would have really added something to it.
And of course, this episode, up until the last, 2 minutes, is the one episode that does that. I mean, we do see the ship changing. We do see, bits ripped off. We see, we get a whole, I don't know if they were I think they were probably using digital models by this stage, but if they hadn't been, if this was still in the age of the kind of traditional huge models, they would have been having to work out ways to kind of rip great holes in it and, you know, blast it to pieces and kind of keep it going. I mean, this is the one, and of course it takes place over the course of, well, not quite a year, but, you know, the better part of a year. So there is that sense of, you know, from day to day and week to week, changes are happening and they're being kind of written on the skin of the ship as well as on the characters. You know, Janeway gets scarred, Tuvok gets blinded. You know, these are kind of, if we're kind of thinking of continuity, these are things that kind of carry forward. They're not reset until the point at the very end where it is all reset and the whole thing has to, you know, never have happened in order that everything can kind of go back in the box. And I know for many people that's a kind of controversial element of the story, and you know, it doesn't really bother me, to be perfectly honest, largely because I think it's kind of set up that that's what's going to happen. Firstly, we know that's what's going to happen because they've pushed things too far. Do you know what I mean? They've kind of gone too far. It's a bit like where you have a story and, you know, random, you know, lead characters start dying left, right and centre. You kind of know, okay, fine. Well, this is not going to stick. You know, they're going to have to reverse this. But also, I suppose, because of the whole nature of the time ship and the fact that things can be changed back and forth constantly is there baked into the episode from the very beginning. So I suppose it's kind of not surprising that, you know, the situation we end up at the end is not, you know, kind of what we've been watching on the way there. But it is interesting, I think, you know, what it means for Star Trek to do that and to not have all the toys put back in the box, at least within the episode, you know, albeit that the episode itself kind of gets kind of reversed or reset or whatever. Voyager almost kind of gets to do that sort of continuity that maybe Deep Space Nine was doing, but within the space of a two-parter, and then obviously is kind of forced to abandon it and everything has to kind of go back to how it was. And there is something slightly jarring, I think, about that final shot where the time ship blows up. It's all been incredibly intense. We've been watching this show that feels very different. It does feel more like a kind of Battlestar or something. And then there's a kind of, it's not even a wipe, I don't think, but it's like Voyager then comes in again from the bottom left-hand corner, and it's almost like this could be any season 1 or 2 episode of Voyager. Do you know what I mean? It just feels so conventional and so safe and so sterile, as you say. And it's reassuring, but it's also, I find it slightly jarring. It's just such you're being yanked so far back, I suppose, because you're being yanked right back to the kind of the most sort of innocent, most unproblematic version of what Voyager is, you know, trying to be, as opposed to this grittier, nastier, darker, sort of edgier stuff that we've had going on for the last 90 minutes.
I suppose the people on the other side, that people that probably did it incredibly well would be Enterprise. Even before you say season 3, you know, it leans into that submarine element. It's like out there in probably the vastness of space, or if we're going to get the Atlantic or the Pacific. And when the ship gets damaged and say something like Minefield in season 2, I think we probably all expected the next episode, that huge tear in the hull is completely gone. But then they kind of lean into, well, sometimes you've got to find a port, a safe harbour to carry out repairs, and that might be quite significant. But they really push that element in sort of season 3, where you think of something like Azati Prime and damage. This submarine style ship is incredibly broken, torn apart, and it carries that on all the way into early season 4 before it can even be fixed, because there is no harbour, there's no safe port to dock in, where we probably take that for granted in the Next Generation. You know, I watched Q-Who the other day, a huge, you know, 8 decks are torn out, a nice hole in the hull, and then the episode ends with them all off to the nearest space station to kind of probably just get fixed again, and on they kind of go. So you kind of, I think Enterprise very much, yeah, it was that sort of submarine style ship, but it kind of lent itself to being quite authentic, I guess, in that respect too.
Yeah, I think that's true. And in some ways, we kind of think of Enterprise as a show that is sort of going back a little bit to the sort of next gen Voyager, sort of less experimental, less kind of adventurous style of Star Trek. You know, the more the kind of UPN Star Trek rather than the, you know, whatever DS9 was, kind of off in its own sandbox doing its own thing. But it's true, they did kind of lean into that stuff, and particularly in season 3, they, you know, I guess in season 3, Brannon Braga got to do his year-long Year of Hell in effect. I mean, he wanted to do this as a longer story. I think it would have been great as a longer story. On the other hand, they would have then had to reset it after more episodes, and maybe people would have got even more fed up about that. But with season 3 of Enterprise, they found a way to do it, and they didn't have a big reset button. I mean, they kind of changed the stakes along the way, and they kind of they moved the goalposts, I suppose you could say, along the way in terms of what was going on and what the mission was. But they did actually find, for my money anyway, you know, quite an interesting way out of it. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on what you were saying earlier about Star Trek kind of leaning into this nautical stuff, whether it's Nicholas Meyer or whether it's you know, on Voyager. And Voyager leans into it quite a bit generally. I mean, when we see things like funerals, they're given a very kind of naval flavor. You get the bosun's whistle being blown, for example, in is it One Small Step, the one where they find the old spaceship? That has a real kind of nautical feel, that moment. This, though, is probably the most nautical inflected episode that Voyager does, or possibly even that Star Trek does in some ways, insofar as there's kind of references all over the shop. You know, you've got the watch that Chakotay has replicated for Janeway as a replica of an ancient sailor's watch. You get Tom Paris, before he mentions Captain Nemo, he mentions Captain Bligh, the captain of the Bounty, who obviously was his crew mutinied. So there's this kind of sense. They talk about the Titanic as well, and these bulkheads that they've developed. And I suppose this mostly it centres on Tom Paris. Usually we think of Tom Paris's kind of historical period as being a bit more kind of like 1950s, 60s, something in that kind of region. But here we find out that he does have this kind of passion that goes back to these kind of sailing adventures. And certainly in 30 Days, he kind of talks about that and how, you know, he just loved anything to do with any of these stories to do with the sea, these kind of heroic seafaring stories. But it is also an episode that quite explicitly sort of names its reference points in a way that I think is quite interesting, because sometimes Star Trek can be a little bit coy or a little bit you know, and Voyager in particular, I think, will kind of do episodes that are actually a riff on a particular inspiration or a particular reference, but doesn't ever acknowledge it necessarily. This is one where it's kind of really, it's acknowledged on screen insofar as Paris literally calls Aronnax. No, there you go. It's acknowledged on screen insofar as Paris literally calls Anoraks Nemo. So making the allusion to Captain Nemo in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But it's a parallel that runs between the two stories. You know, it's more than just about the captain. I mean, I think there are a lot of parallels between Nemo and Anoraks. One of the most striking elements that links the two stories is, as I just confused myself, the narrator in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is called Aronnax, and the villain in Year of Hell is called Anorax. You know, this is not an accident. This is clearly another thing that is kind of leading us in that direction. In both stories, a small group from the original ship end up on the villain's ship. So, you know, in 20,000 Leagues, it's Aronnax, Ned Land, and Conseil, Aronnax's sort of assistant. And there's this dynamic very much, which is replayed in the Voyager episode, where Aronnax is sort of pally with the villain, with Nemo, is kind of getting to know him, is interested in him, sort of respects him. They have a kind of mutual respect. They're, you know, sharing their knowledge of the sea and, you know, talking about what books to read and so on. Ned Land is in the kind of, is the Paris character. You know, Paris is playing the Ned Land role in the Voyager episode, really, who's the guy who's sort of saying, yeah, forget all of that. I don't care how cultured and sophisticated and interesting this guy is. We've got to get off this ship. We've got to do something. We've got to act, basically. And Ned Land in the original is, a harpooner. So he's a kind of man of action, as opposed to the kind of professorial Aronnax. Interestingly, I don't feel this comes across in the novel, unless I just didn't pick up on it. But in the movie of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which was a, you know, very successful, very influential movie, and I'm sure the writers of this Voyager episode would be familiar with, as well as with the book. There's also a sense that Ned Land, who's played by Kirk Douglas, in a very odd role, I think, for him. He sort of plays him as a bit of a kind of, you know, Dick Van Dyke in Mary Poppins. I think he's sort of going for something similar, and I don't know, to me anyway, it doesn't quite come off. But there's an element of Ned Land in that movie where he's a bit of a womanizer. So he has this song that he sings at various points all about his conquests all around the world and so on. So again, you know, is there a sort of parallel with Tom Paris, who we think of as, you know, this kind of, you know, maybe less so by this point going into, you know, into season 4, but a guy with a bit of a reputation. And I suppose in both these episodes, in Year of Hell and in 30 Days, actually, you know, we get this sense of Tom Paris as someone who's been kind of pinged back. I mean, talking about, you know, undoing the past and pressing the reset button. They're both episodes in which, to some extent, Tom Paris is reset to kind of early Voyager Tom Paris, insofar as him and Chakotay are totally at odds. And there's a moment where Chakotay says to him, look, either we respect the command structure of Voyager, even though we're far away from Voyager, or we just, you know, fight this out with our fists, basically. And I think the implication is, and I'm going to win, so, you know, you lose either way. In 30 Days, he kind of makes a comment about the fact that, you know, yeah, I'm in prison again. So I'm kind of, you know, right back where I started almost. So I don't know. I think it's interesting that they borrowed not only the kind of the idea of this ship and this mysterious captain who's both sort of sophisticated and, you know, ethically monstrous, who's willing to do terrible things, but also that they, you know, in the characters from Voyager that they chose to interact with that ship, that they very much played out the same roles as in the source material.
I think it's always interesting thinking about the character of Tom Paris, and I listened to their latest podcast today. I'm sure this will date it somewhat, but it was Blood Fever, and like they were like, oh yes, and Tom Paris, you're a keen rock climber. And they're like, when did that ever come up? And it's always one of these ones with Tom Paris that always seems to be the cipher of like whatever we need a character to be to, you know, fit in. Tom Paris will be that one. They seem to treat him in quite a loose way with his development in a way compared to the others, which were a bit more static. You know, I think it's always that great line in sort of Year of Hell where he's like, he starts talking about, the Titanic, and like Jane was like, oh, I think you were kind of like, I always thought of you as like automobiles. Oh yeah, I'm also into big boats as well from the 20s. He is just anything. And you can almost sense that sometimes when you listen to Robert Duncan McNeill talk about the characters, like the amount of curveballs that come up about Tom Paris of like, oh, and then he's this and he's that. And it's like, where did that come from? Is that the case? I've never seen that. Like the character doesn't get to play. And even when you talk about the prison aspect there of 30 Days, that kind of came out of nowhere. Like they came up short with this episode in terms of like Tom Paris goes underwater, everything that kind of goes on. They were like, oh, we're 10 minutes short. Why don't we just chuck him back into prison? So even though there can be this sometimes grand design where you can think, oh yeah, like they definitely wanted Tom Paris to be this character, perhaps in something like Year of Hell and then tie it in. There can also be that accidental one with 30 Days where it's like, oh, right, what do we do? Oh, we'll put him in prison.
That is fascinating. I didn't realize that. It'll be interesting, you know, when the Delta Flyers do catch up to these episodes. That is a great podcast. I think really fascinating always to hear Robert Duncan McNeill in particular, his sort of memories and so on about these episodes and their kind of reflections on them years later when they often don't really remember them very well at all. I think that's true. Yes. I mean, it's not just Paris. Chakotay gets it even worse, you know, whether it's boxing, whether it's, you know, there's always something that conveniently Chakotay happens to be an expert in, even though he's never mentioned it or expressed any interest in it. I mean, I think that is just something about the way, I suppose the thing is Voyager, well, they could bring in extra characters. I was going to say they can't bring in, you know, a stellar cartographer or whatever, but they could. I mean, there's plenty of crewmen that we haven't seen that they could, you know, if they need someone to be an expert on something, a bit like on the original series, you know, where they had a historian, they had a sort of costume specialist at one point, didn't they? They you know, they have all these specialists with quite niche areas of expertise. I suppose on Voyager, it has to be one of the like senior staff who happens to be an expert on whatever it is, and it does generally come out of nowhere because everything in Voyager sort of comes out of nowhere. But it's true in this episode, you know, it's Paris that kind of, I suppose, is the one with the historical interest and the expertise. Although, as I say, it's Chakotay who manufactures that replica Captain's Watch, so he's obviously got a mind to this period of history as well in some ways. Maybe they both do, but maybe then they're both the two characters who get lumped with all this stuff.
But then you could argue that he is the outlaw submarine captain. You know, you think of his, was it the Valjean, his Maquis ship? He was the original outlaw submarine captain in terms of Voyager, in terms of caretaker. So yeah, I suppose he kind of does tie in a little bit to that.
That's true. Yes, that is true. He's the kind of Nemo in that sense, and Janeway is the one kind of trying to bring him to justice. I think there is a kind of interesting aspect with both these stories. I mean, Nemo is a kind of compelling villain. I think there's one reason that book has had the kind of cultural impact that it has. Partly it's the kind of underwater world, partly it is the kind of imagination in it of him, you know, imagining, as you said, this submarine that didn't exist at the time, and also, you know, the breathing apparatus, all these things that didn't exist at the time, you know, the kind of futurism of it. I think also Nemo is kind of a fascinating character. You know, he exists even beyond that book. I mean, he turn up in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, that comic, and you know, he's a kind of character that, and as a namesake, he's one of those kind of larger than life characters. He's one of those, you know, he's going to be on your list of like top 5 or top 10 Star Trek villains, probably. Although probably not yours, Lee, having listened to your track ranks on the movie villains, where you managed to pick the most obscure, least obvious choices. But he's going to be up there, right? And I think that's partly because, again, he's a very compelling character. I mean, Nemo is partly compelling because he's quite mysterious. We never quite learn the whole story behind what's going on for him, but we do learn that there's an element of kind of vengeance going on. We learn that he's lost family, because he breaks down at one point and weeps in front of a picture of his wife and children, I think. Anarax, again, similarly, he has that lock of his wife's hair. He's lost his wife, and he describes it in terms of losing his family because because of the children that would have been born, because he's so obsessed with time. He kind of knows that he has, you know, this potential future timeline that's been robbed from him, essentially because his wife's been taken away. Interestingly, another character who kind of ties into that is Nero in the 2009 movie. Now, obviously, Nero, we might think of as being named after the Roman emperor, which, you know, makes sense with the Romulans and the Romans and so on. But equally, Nero is extremely close to Nemo as a name for, you know, that captain. And he has a very similar story insofar as his wife, who was pregnant, I think, at the time. So again, his wife and a child, albeit an unborn child, were taken from him. And that's what kind of spurs his revenge. So there is that kind of sense that there's a similarity between those characters, I suppose. And I think with both Nemo and Anarax, what makes them compelling is precisely that they are kind of complex. You know, these are characters that Aranax in 20,000 Leagues can sort of say of Nemo, well, he's a fascinating man. I'm kind of enthralled by him. Chakotay can say to Paris in Year of Hell, Anarax is an enlightened man, he says. You know, he's not just a thug. He's not just a kind of villain. Obviously, Paris sort of sees through that. He thinks that's, you know, as maybe, but the fact is what he's doing is terrible. And in both those stories, there's a moment where the villain does something that kind of pushes this, you know, whether it's Aranax or Chakotay, their character who's sort of slightly enthralled to them, or at least slightly kind of, I mean, Chakotay becomes fascinated in this idea of understanding time and so on. He seems very seduced by it. But in both those stories, the captain at some point does something awful. So in 20,000 Leagues, it's that he sinks this ship and all the people drown, and it's horrific, and it sort of changes slightly even Aranax's attitude towards him. Although he knows this is what he's been doing all this time, to actually witness it seems to kind of change things slightly. With Chakotay, again, it's the same thing. He knows that Anarax has been wiping out civilizations. I mean, he's committed genocide on like a vast scale. If you think of, you know, Kevin Uxbridge in Next Generation, who wipes out one species, you know, Anarax has wiped out 5 before breakfast. I mean, the scale of kind of devastation he's causing is absolutely vast. Probably, you know, going to be up there with like the worst crimes in Star Trek, I suppose. But Chakotay doesn't really sort of engage with the horror of that until they witness it, you know, until he sort of sees him doing it. And then that seems to kind of, that changes things a little bit once he's actually witnessed it. And obviously we don't, all we see is like this beam being fired from orbit. We don't get even, what we did in Enterprise, where you got a sort of glimpse of the kind of horror of this attack where huge numbers of people are being killed. It's very much not interested in the sort of horror of it on that kind of visceral level. But in both cases, you've got these men who, although in some ways their motivations might be understandable, and in some ways they even have kind of admirable qualities, they're both willing to do the most appalling, really shockingly appalling things, and feel justified in doing that.
It's always one of those ones. It always feels slightly disappointing, where I think like the idea that time is the enemy is something that Star Trek does quite often. But in this one, you have this element where, as you say, it's wiping out these planets, these civilizations, and as you say, it's one of the most shocking possible things that you can do, is just wiping something from existence. And I think that impact is slightly lost on us, where it's happening so frequently, but it's nameless species. It means nothing to us. It's like, you just see it arrive at the beginning, and it's like this CGI city that just poofs away. It's not like it's a Talaxians or even a Kazon where we're like, oh, God, imagine they didn't exist. There's no impact on that. But as you think of something like Remember Me, where it plays into that horror element, where, yes, it's slightly different, where people just cease to exist. People like, no, I've never heard of that person. And it is like a horror where it drives people mad and so on. And I think that's an element that's kind of lost in Year of Hell, is that personal toll of what's going on outside of the ship. It's good that it's so gripping what's going on within the ship in terms of the damage that's being done and its effect. But in terms of all this outside kind of genocide, it doesn't register, and it could be really compelling horror, I guess.
I think that's true. And the sense of, yeah, I mean, who knows? Maybe if they'd had a 3-parter, they could have gone into more of this. I mean, they've already got to juggle everything that's happening on Voyager with everything that's happening on the Krenim ship. And I do think we get, in some ways, because we're kind of jumping, suddenly we jumped 2 months or something. Sometimes it can feel like we're getting a little bit shortchanged on this story. I mean, it'd be interesting, I don't know if this was one of the episodes that they novelized, but if they did, whether that would give an opportunity to sort of bulk it out a little bit. Because also, by the end, you've got Janeway has formed this alliance of, sort of mini, or maybe not a mini federation, that might be going a bit far, but, kind of precursor to what she does in The Void, where she kind of gets all these people together. She gets this kind of ragtag group of ships from various different species together to join and sort of, take the fight to Anarax. That's another aspect of the story that we don't see anything of. We don't really know who any of those people are, what their story is, who the captains are, do you know what I mean? Like there's all this kind of stuff that we're not seeing, in this story. And equally, you're right, these planets that are being, winked out of existence. And it's interesting, I suppose, because it is sort of telling a kind of, it is interested in the kind of geopolitics of this area of space, because that's what is, that's sort of the gist of what's changing in the episode. We start off, and I can't remember, we start off with the Zal, isn't it? They're the kind of dominant species at the start of the episode. And the Zal ambassador tells them, don't worry about the Krenim. They used to be the big shots around here, but we fought them, and despite their temporal weapons, we managed to win ultimately, and now they're a bit of a has-been kind of lot. And then obviously, we have this version where the Krenim are much more powerful and have these much bigger ships and so on. So it does sort of feel like it's an episode that's interested in the balance of power between all these different species. But ultimately, we don't really get to see enough of that to get more than a glimpse of it. We sort of have to imagine that somehow for ourselves. And I think in some ways, maybe that is a little bit of a shame.
Yeah, and I suppose it was just the reality. There was so little breathing room to kind of do these things and to flower it. But, I think it could have just, especially if you've got the ship just roaming the quadrant, where it does feel like it is just all within this small area of space, where I think it could have been more interesting at kind of floating around, especially if you've got hundreds and hundreds of years. You don't just have to kind of kick around the sort of same street. You could be kind of going into Borg space potentially. You could be going to where the Kazon are. You could be going to where, the Vaadwaur, all these different species, it could make it a really huge thing, because for all the times that Voyager encounters Anorax's ship, it's only like a couple of times, so it didn't always have to feel like they were kind of boxers kind of dancing around each other.
That's a good point. I mean, it's presumably a vast area of space that they're fighting over, because this was a massive empire. The Krenim, they're called an Imperium. I mean, interesting, I suppose there's this parallel again with Imperial France in 20,000 Leagues, and the kind of and this sort of imperial legacy, I suppose, that's part of the background maybe to that story. But this was a great empire in space. You're right, also in time. I mean, I don't know that it's something that necessarily registers that strongly, but they say they've been doing this for 200 years, and obviously they're protected from time. So it's like, that's meaningless on one level. But there is this kind of sense of, the scale of it is huge. I mean, you'd expect that we'd be dealing with the repercussions of this for seasons of Voyager. Do you know what I mean? Like, this area of space has got to be so vast. It's going to take them ages to get across it, whatever configuration it ultimately ends up in. I wonder also whether this sense that, they've been on the ship for 200 years, even though they're not aging, it sort of suggests something maybe of the idea that, for Captain Nemo's ship in 20,000 Leagues, so our characters, they're captured, they're made prisoners. Well, they're kind of rescued. Their ship is damaged. They're in the sea. Nemo lets them come on board, but the condition is basically they can never leave. So it's kind of a life sentence. They are prisoners and they're kind of suffering a life sentence. Equally, although Anorax is goal oriented, is hopefully he's going to fix this thing one day and everything's going to go back to how he wants it, and then everyone can leave and probably dismantle their old ship and kind of go back to their lives, and he can have his happy time on Kiana Prime with his wife and his future children and so on. At the same time, it's gone on for so long, as the younger guy says, everyone he knows has died. They have effectively served a life sentence on this ship because, they've given up everything in the same way as the characters in 20,000 Leagues are being expected to give up everything, to give up any hope of ever going home, of ever seeing their loved ones again.
It's almost a complete contradiction where it doesn't even make logistical sense. Like, you have this ship going around this small area of the Delta Quadrant for 200 years trying to change history, while they are completely stuck in this little time bubble where they are as young as they were when they started 200 years ago. If they were successful in bringing back their planet, it doesn't bring back their wife, their loved ones. Like that, the logic of that doesn't make sense to me whatsoever, because if they manage to bring back, restoration, 100% restoration, until even the last blade of grass, but that's 200 odd years ago, the people that they are fighting to bring back, unless they just want to bring back their planet, are never coming back. So it's always that odd bit at the end where he's reunited with his wife. It's but that's 200 odd years in the past. She is gone. How is she alive now? But I must say, it is a nice ending in a way where it has that almost horror element where it's they've killed the bad guy, but there he is. He's still working on his plan. In, a couple hundred years, he might do this all again. Their plan just ultimately makes no sense in the end, which always slightly bugs me.
That had never really occurred to me, I have to say, before, but I just sort of assumed somehow their time on the ship got erased along with the changes that they'd made. But it does sort of raise this interesting question. When did this 200 years start? I mean, I'm not great with time travel stories. This is the second episode in a row where we've been talking about time travel stories, and I've been getting my self tied up in knots with it. But, because one thing that I noticed looking into this episode, and I never quite understood this before, is that there's the episode before and after in the previous season where Kes has some kind of interaction with the Krenim, and there's a Krenim torpedo, I think, that kind of plays into that episode. Now, before and after in this episode, my understanding is that Anorax has undone the events of before and after by the time we get into this, before the start of Year of Hell, but that by the end of Year of Hell, the Year of Hell has been erased, but presumably everyone remember. I can't remember how before and after ended, but do they remember whatever Kes told them from that episode? Did she carry? I can't even remember. But anyway, that's the kind of status quo that we're returned to. But then it's true, where in time are we? I think we're meant to just, it goes back to day one, doesn't it? So that year of their 200 years has reset. and Anarax was there. He was at home. But he wasn't at home then, was he? It's true. It's a good point.
And it's day one of Voyager entering Krenom space, where it's like, oh, thank you very much. Yeah, this is areas in dispute. Be careful. Okay, thank you very much. Whereas that 200 years should that reset, unless they live an incredibly long life, doesn't that person being in their house should be 200 odd years ago. So unless that is a flashback to 200 years earlier, and then day one is actually 200 odd years in the future when we sort of see Voyager enter Krenom space for the first time, it's one of those things when you just stop and think about it, and for years it never even clicked with me, but then I just sat down and thought, oh, that makes no sense.
Well, you've ruined it for me today. I mean, I've been watching this for 25 years or something. It never even occurred to me. But that is an interesting point, whether the logic of it kind of holds up. And obviously that's always sort of a danger with time travel stories, I suppose, is that they're sort of notoriously difficult to, to put together in a way that makes perfect logical sense. And, maybe this one doesn't. I do quite I like the idea that he gets this sort of happy ever after. Actually, Janeway is the one who gives him what he wants, effectively, and that she sends him back there. But then also there is, as you said, this kind of horror movie moment where the last shot of the episode, it lingers on these his same, whatever those wibbly lines, timeline things are. He's kind of studying them obsessively again. And there is that sort of sense that this could kind of go on and on forever. It's a bit of a problem, I think. I mean, I have to say, we had it with Enterprise, with the temporal Cold War. We have it now in Discovery with this idea that there were temporal wars, which I think are meant to be separate from that and are an important part of the kind of period between, whatever the latest track we have between the sort of Picard era, I suppose, and this future era and Discovery, that there's going to be this kind of massive galaxy spanning temporal war or wars of some kind. I find them a bit of a headache because I sort of feel like, how do you ever end a temporal war? Do you know what I mean? Can't you it's a bit of a problem with the Borg in First Contact. Okay, so that didn't work. Why didn't they just try again the next day and do it slightly differently? Do you know what I mean? Once you establish that you can kind of wage war in that way, can't you just keep going until you win? Do you know what I mean?
It's like Janeway says, time travel gives her a sore head. I mean, it makes ultimately... it falls apart under the slightest bit of scrutiny. It's absolutely ridiculous. What's to stop? And even just practical things where what's to stop the Borg cube just going into the past in Borg space and then just sauntering to 2024 Earth without any sort of starships along the way. It just all makes no sense. And I suppose it's one of those ones you kind of, for better or worse with Star Trek, sometimes you're kind of okay, I'm just going to go along with it. It is a silly sci-fi show and I'm going to try and take it seriously, but I'm not going to get bogged down in it. It can only take away from the enjoyment, I think.
Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not something we need to think through too carefully. I mean, maybe Jules Verne is wise to not necessarily give us all the information about, actually Nemo's backstory is left fairly oblique. It's fairly kind of, it's sort of hinted at, but it's not really explained in great detail. Maybe sometimes that's the way to go, is to not give us too much detail so we can't pick holes in it. But, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that struck me about 20,000 Leagues, as I say, is this sense that there are obviously parallels with Star Trek and with specific Star Trek episodes, but also just this kind of, I suppose this kind of futurism, this world, this idea of, creating this vessel that is so impressive. And you get Captain Nemo doing the kind of speech where he says, how many decks there are, the size, the weight, he's kind of talking through the stats, a bit like, in Caretaker, we get that with Voyager, it's got how many decks it's got, this sort of, almost like a sort of car salesman or something, telling you what all the features are. And again, in First Contact, I think Picard and Lily, doesn't he have that moment where he's talking her through what the Enterprise is and how sort of big and impressive it is. That there is this kind of sense. This is it's an iconic vessel, and particularly that Disney version is an iconic, as I say, sort of iconic piece of design. I discovered I don't think it's there anymore, but in Euro Disney for years, I think they had a model of the Nautilus that you could go it was, you know, it was kind of underwater and you could go down some steps, obviously in a building or whatever, and you ended up in a kind of museum, but they made it seem as if you were going inside this submarine, and the sort of, you know, the thrill of being able to do that, it would be a bit like being able to go inside the Enterprise and, you know, poke around it. There is something about these kind of fantastical, vessels that is very seductive, is very appealing. And they are, as I say, you know, it is very kind of iconic. Also, another thing that struck me, they use, you know, in terms of this kind of futurism, I said so there's a submarine, you know, basically like kind of scuba gear ahead of its time. They also, they don't shoot the animals that they're hunting. They stun them, you know, like very much like in Star Trek. They shoot these kind of pellets that, electrocute them. So again, I suppose it's that kind of, you know, sci-fi futurism. And there are a lot of parallels between the kind of sci-fi futurism of space and the sci-fi futurism of the sea. I mean, we saw it again with, I don't know if you ever watched Sequest, but that was basically a Star Trek show, only underwater. You know, in all but name, it was kind of, very much drawing on the sort of Star Trek model, but doing it on this kind of futuristic submarine. It even had, you know, a dolphin, like supposedly is down in Station Ops, kind of as a member of the crew that we got to see.
Yeah, I've never seen Sequest. Like it's one of those 90s shows that just, if it wasn't on Sky, I never got the chance to see it.
Oh, you missed out. I was quite struck by this point you made earlier that time as a kind of agent, time as an enemy, in Year of Hell is something that Star Trek kind of plays with. Obviously, we've seen it with, you know, Malcolm McDowell in Star Trek Generations. Time is the fire in which we burn, and so on, and kind of picked up again in Picard, I suppose. One of the things that I suppose marks Annorax as being mad as well as bad is this sort of obsession with time. And certainly, Paris basically thinks he's lost it, you know, and I suppose his crew does as well, because effectively they kind of mutiny at the end, or at least, you know, one of them does for sure. And there's this sense that this kind of superstition is almost his undoing somehow. But weirdly, there's a very strong parallel, I think, between Annorax and Janeway, because Janeway also at the end of Year of Hell is shown as being deeply superstitious about Voyager. You know, she has that conversation with Tuvok where she's saying, you know, this is not just a ship. It is a member of our family. It needs us. You know, the same kind of sentimentalizing, the same kind of superstitious, irrational, attitude coming from, you know, someone who we keep being told is a scientist. It's interesting. And I don't know whether that's deliberate or not, but it does seem to kind of draw a sort of parallel between them. And obviously it's Janeway who at the end of Year of Hell, although the Krenim ship is the thing that looks, you know, it doesn't looks not unlike a submarine or not unlike the Nautilus. You know, it's long and kind of vaguely cylindrical, and it's got a kind of pointy bit at the front. It's actually Janeway and Voyager that ends up being the battering ram and being the one that, you know, smashes into the ship to destroy it in exactly the way that Captain Nemo does in 20,000 Leagues. So she's kind of, I don't know. And I think in that episode, I mean, it's a great Janeway episode, but she goes quite far. I mean, there are quite a few Voyager episodes where Janeway, you know, slightly crosses a few lines, if you know what I mean. I mean, a lot of people love Equinox, for example, which is one of those episodes where she kind of, you know, goes a little bit too far, maybe. And obviously we see Sisko doing the same thing a couple of times in DS9, with, well, for the uniform you mentioned, and again with, Pale Moon Light and episodes like that. But, this I think is definitely another one where she is, you know, she's making questionable decisions. She is somewhat obsessed. I mean, Annorax is somewhat obsessed, but she is also, somewhat obsessive. You know, she says that she threatens to shut down the Doctor and so on. Fair enough. It's a stressful situation. You know, no one's going to be at their best, but I wonder if that is another added element in there, that somehow there are these two captains facing off against each other and they're both being sort of slightly destroyed to some extent by this impossible, awful situation that they're in. As you say, like this kind of dance that they're in between the two of them. You know, they both have to, let go of all that, to erase all of that, to go back to the kind of, cheerful, happy, you know, status quo where Janeway's, I don't know, contemplating whether do we take this route or that route, and it's all quite kind of banal and cheerful, and Annorax is, you know, going off to have dinner with his wife.
I think it's interesting, like, kind of what you touched on there. I was almost reminded, and it never clicked till now. It's like, it's similar to Khan and Kirk in Wrath of Khan. They never physically face off. You see them, they chat, I think, at most twice, maybe once actually, like over the view screen at the end of part 1. Like even at the climax of part 2, there's no chat with them, I think, on the view screen. It's been a couple of weeks since I last watched the episode, but I think it's just that one moment where like they only have ever one interaction over a screen over pretty much just shy of a year. And I find that interesting as well, that the ship, you know, as you say, Voyager becomes like, it's a human, it's a character, we accept that. But like, I find that fascinating, what Paris touches on, where he's like, you know, Anarax has viewed time as like almost a physical construct and so on that can be bent to his will. Like, it's something that is just completely cerebral that he believes can be bent to his will. And it's become this sort of almost a manifestation of a similar to a predator. You know, time is a predator that's like stalking us, you know, in a way that's kind of going on here with something like kind of Anarax. It's so interesting to see kind of the duality of them both, and sort of how they've humanized two very, very different things, one physical and one that is, you know, without kind of form.
There's also this idea, I suppose, that Anarax is being punished. I mean, I think he says it himself, you know, I suppose he's being punished in a kind of classical Greek sense for hubris. You know, he thinks he can understand time, the mysteries of the universe. He thinks he can kind of unravel that. And, well, a bit like Picard in Tapestry pulling on his strand, what Anarax has done, he's pulled on one of the timelines and he's screwed the whole thing up in a kind of horrific way. And he's sort of being punished almost for that in this very personal way.
But then I think that's kind of similar, where I'm sure you've had conversations or maybe even thoughts yourself. I know I certainly have at points where you think of what we've gone through the past 15 months, where we have been isolated, our lives have changed by and large for the worse. There is good to be found there, but there are times where I think we've probably all felt, is the universe out to get us? What have I done to deserve this? That we have viewed something that's completely out with our complete control as we are being punished for what did we do? And it can gnaw at a person's mind. And, you know, if we think the way that people's mental health has been affected by 15 months in isolation, what must it be like for 200 years where, you know, if you were to probably be one of those people where you had an opportunity to go 50 months, you know, go back to that wet market in Wuhan, make one change to the timeline, and you might try and think, I can make things all the better and, you know, there won't be a COVID-19. But when you pull at that tapestry, what would completely change? You know, what has been a positive that's come out of it that would completely unravel for someone else? People that we've lost, we would get back, but who else would we lose potentially in the process? It'd be one of those ones. I think I'm always fascinated by the butterfly effect, the idea that, you know, if a butterfly, you know, flaps its wings in sort of Africa or something like that, it can cause a tornado elsewhere and stuff like that. It's just a fascinating thing. And there's times where you think, especially as you get older, if I'd made that decision then, where would have happened? And it's sometimes fascinating to think about where those little butterfly flutters could have changed people's lives. And it almost terrifies you. You know, you think of it when you're in a new relationship or you've got a new job or good things have happened. There's also the equal side where you think to yourself, if I hadn't have met that person on that day, if I hadn't gone to that pub, I might not have met that person. Or you even think about your parents, where I think of like my parents, they met in a bar. What happens if my dad was hungover that day and didn't go? I wouldn't exist. And it can be terrifying that just that one small incident or pull of a change of a timeline can completely destroy and ruin lives. It can be very, very scary and probably can drive people to some crazy anxiety.
Well, that's an interesting point. And obviously, you know, Paris talks about Anarax as being, I think he says he's paranoid, he's a megalomaniac. You know, he talks about him in terms of kind of his poor mental health, essentially. And it is very much this idea that he's trying to exercise a level of control that really shouldn't be possible. You know, I suppose there is that sense that it's a bit like, you know, meddling with nature, isn't it? Meddling with time. It's not gonna work out well. And I suppose like those kind of
Jurassic Park, don't you? You know,
people exactly.
Never stopped it. You know, they did this, the scientists, and then bang, that's it kind of out in the world. You've got your time ship and you never even thought if you even should.
Yeah. Well, it's also, I think that idea that it kind of ends in madness, this kind of, obsessing over these things. I mean, there's that Voyager episode, Latent Image, isn't there, where the Doctor can't, you know, is kind of his program is caught in a kind of loop about this decision that he made, and why did he make that decision, and why didn't he do something else, and what could have worked out differently, and so on. In some ways, like those kind of sort of thought experiments, or those kind of daydreams, or whatever you want to call them, that you're saying, what if this hadn't happened, what if this didn't happen, ultimately they do lead to madness in a way, because I suppose they expose how little control we have in some ways. And I think it's Anorak's attempting to have complete control that is what sort of destroys him in a way. They are sort of overreaching the Krenim. This idea that they can win with these temporal weapons is going to be ultimately what sort of brings them down. That's what brings their empire down, I suppose, is trying to, do something that is really in the hands of God or the universe, or, whatever you want to see it as. It's almost kind of blasphemous, this idea. It also, just when we were talking about punishment, it reminded me a little bit of, there's a line, in Richard II, the Shakespeare play, where Richard II says, "I wasted time, and now doth time waste me," which is a little bit, and he's in prison at this point. He's kind of, sort of lamenting how he got there. But I suppose there's that sense, for Anorak, it's very literally, he's kind of meddled with time, and now time is meddling with him. Time is sort of, getting its own back somehow. Personally, I find these kind of superstitious notions a bit silly. Do you know what I mean? I can't help seeing that in Paris's terms is kind of mad, but I suppose they are things that we associate with a villain in particular. You think of Captain Ahab as well. Captain Ahab has this sort of superstitious hatred of this whale. The whale is a force of nature. The whale no more has a vendetta against him than, than a storm does, or than time is after Anorak or whatever. But it's that idea. It is that kind of paranoid idea that leads to not just destruction, but this kind of self-destruction. But when you think about Anorak and Janeway, I think there's that interesting element. You're right. They have very little relationship with each other. And it's strange that Kirk and Khan have so little relationship with each other, because in The Wrath of Khan, it's so intensely personal. It is very much Khan wants to punish Kirk. He wants to hurt Kirk. He wants to do to him what he feels Kirk has done to him. In Year of Hell, actually, Anorak says quite explicitly, he says, "I bear you no hostility, but you've diverted me from my mission." It's this kind of idea. It's not personal. It's nothing against you. You're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I've got to do what I've got to do. It's kind of, and he, with Chakotay, and even, he tries it with Paris. He lays on the banquet. He, gets them the fancy wine and so on. He tries to make them happy and comfortable and so on his ship. There's this sense of like, we can be civil to each other. We can socialize. We can kind of, get on a personal level, but don't expect you're going to have any impact on my sort of deranged genocidal scheme, because that's separate. Basically, I have my mission, and I'm not going to be. There's not going to be any kind of deviation from it. But at the same time, on a kind of personal level, there is no hostility. There is no. They're not. It's not. You mentioned nemesis. There isn't really a sense of a nemesis. There isn't that kind of relationship. There isn't that kind of hatred. They are just circumstances have put them at odds with each other somehow.
Yeah, it is that. And it's even like the one thing I just never buy is I never buy into how easily Chakotay goes along with everything. Like, he has no skin in this game. Like, he's along with Restoration, but it's not like he's like, we could have, like, you think of some of the Maquis members that have been lost by this point of the show, or Hogan, or other kind of characters along the way, where they're like, if we'd made this change, we could have had, like, kept Voyager's crew, or we could have got them back home, etc. There's nothing where it's kind of like, it's just another person going slightly mad with time, and there's, like, Tom Paris kind of, like, hitting his head against the wall. Like, I just don't buy into Chakotay, how he kind of gets kind of wrapped up in it. And as you say, like, there's nothing personal. At most it's kind of like you get the glib remark at the end where it's like, I'll put Janeway out of her misery, but that's just kind of like action movie schlock sort of thing. I think that's dynamic would have been more interesting over the potential course of the season.
Yeah, I suppose that's a possibility. I know what you mean. Like, Chakotay sort of, Paris has the easy role in a sense, insofar as he is saying what we expect our crew to be saying. Chakotay has to sort of convince us. It's sort of always the way when someone's loyalty is in question, or there's like, you know, a temptation for them to do something that we know is wrong or whatever. In some ways, I think that's the harder one to write and to play and to kind of believe in. I suppose we just have to believe, A, that he thinks it might be possible, and that they've seen so much damage already by this point. You know, Tuvok's been blinded. I don't know what else has happened. Lots of people have been killed in this, you know, in this particular year, that he's thinking, oh, if we can undo all of that, that would be great. And we could kind of avoid this terrible, you know, situation. B, I suppose we're meant to believe that he is genuinely, like Anorax, fascinated by time. I mean, Tom Paris says, oh, he's flattering you, you know, saying that you want, you know, the two of us, we understand it. These, you know, stupid underlings don't get it. Maybe there's something. I mean, Chakotay is into his kind of spiritual beliefs. He's into this kind of, sort of transcendental stuff. You know, maybe he's interested in this idea of, you know, these sort of rivers of time and these kind of, you know, being able to understand that somehow. He is someone who's interested in kind of going beyond the human level of experience somehow. I don't know. I agree it's a little bit of a stretch. I think in 20,000 Leagues it makes more sense because Arronax is a scientist. He studies the sea. He's been given the most amazing opportunity, basically, to see things that he could never have witnessed, to, you know, to gain a kind of first-hand understanding of this thing that he is a sort of scholar of, effectively. And also, and he too is being flattered. I mean, Nemo is, you know, gets his books out, I think, and, you know, sort of says how wonderful they are and so on. And you know, tells him what an important figure he is. And Nemo is very much, you know, like he's interested in Arronax because he thinks he's a sort of, kindred spirit and a sort of intellectual and so on. And the others, you know, Ned Land, he doesn't really have any time for. He, I guess, thinks he's just a bit of a thug or something. But I suppose you sort of buy it a little bit more then, that it's not just this question of like, what's the wisest way? Is it safe to escape or are we safer here? But there's also, for Arronax, there's something very tempting about staying on board and going along with what Nemo wants him to do, because it's, you know, it's all his wildest dreams come true. I mean, he would happily stay on board for a year, I think, just, you know, might rather not stay on board for the rest of his life.
You can imagine that being an element where if they'd lent into, you know, I suppose this is you know, Brandon Braga's got his fingerprints all over this, is like a horror element where you can imagine, like, say, for example, there was a bit of an uprising on the ship, kind of like we got towards the end of part 2, where it's like, okay, we're going to essentially put them off the plank of this, you know, Krenim ship. And then you just see them kind of like be pushed out in space where they just cease to exist, you know, out with that bubble. You can imagine that being kind of horrifying, where it's like, you're not just going to die, you are just going to be like ejected from the ship and you will cease to exist in that bubble. I think that could have been quite a terrifying and kind of interesting image for how do you keep a crew in line for 200 odd years on a mission like that. I refuse to believe they would have all been kind of willing participants in a way.
Yeah, that's an interesting point for sure. I mean, even between Chakotay and Paris, we see a kind of mini, almost sort of mini mutiny where Paris is basically saying, why should I follow your orders anymore? Yeah, you're right. I mean, what is this military structure or whatever on the Krenim ship that everyone has been going along with this for, you know, it takes 200 years and the kind of influence of Paris stirring things up as a sort of agent provocateur almost, you know, kind of winding them up to get them to that point. You're right. I mean, why are they still following this guy? I suppose maybe they're following him because they want to get back. You know, it's this kind of like, oh, I was nearly there. You know, I nearly had it. We were so close. It's like a gambler, isn't it? I suppose there is an element of the gambler in Anorax who, you know, they win a load of money, they gamble it, they lose it all, and they're desperate to get back to where they, you know, he's desperate to throw the dice one more time and get back to where he was. He's convinced he can do it because he did it before. And so he just can't give up somehow. But I agree, sort of from a psychological point of view, you kind of imagine they might have got here, you know, a few decades earlier, really.
Yeah, definitely.
Just one final thought that struck me. I mean, you mentioned earlier stellar cartography, and obviously this is the episode that introduces stellar cartography. And it's interesting because we have this big speech about, you know, the kind of the sort of welcome to stellar cartography. This is our new set, blah, 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 at the beginning of part 1. And then at the end, at the end of part 2, when things have reset, they sort of have to mention stellar cartography, because obviously that is something that does carry forward. This is like one of those weird continuity things that actually Voyager does sometimes. It's a bit like when Kes breaks up with Neelix because she's possessed by an alien despot, and then in the next episode they're still broken up even though she's not anymore. It's kind of like, okay, so, or I don't know, Tom and B'Elanna's wedding, which happens to not Tom and B'Elanna, and then we don't see it when it happens to actual Tom and B'Elanna. They sort of play these weird games, but the stellar cartography, I think, is interesting because the idea of it is to give them a shortcut. It's to give them a faster route. And this is something, again, that comes up again and again in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, is these sort of secret passages. They take a passage under the Suez Canal at one point, for example. They're always astonished at how quickly they've got from one place to another because Nemo knows these sort of underwater routes. It's almost like there's a kind of network of wormholes that he's sort of traversing in this ship. Do you know what I mean? That he seems to be able to travel impossible distances somehow incredibly quickly.
It reminds me like the mycelial network in Discovery a little bit, isn't it? Just sort of like these tunnels that they can kind of go through.
Well, I think that's interesting because obviously one of the things that has kind of changed over the course of Star Trek history is this sense of like how far away things are, if you know what I mean, and how fast these starships go. Whether you're in contact, I mean, are you getting orders that take days to respond to and therefore you're kind of pretty much on your own? Are you in constant communication with the people giving the orders? Can you, and Star Trek's never been all that consistent. Can you warp back to Earth in 2 hours, 2 days, 2 months? What is it? I don't know. I mean, I've never sat down and tried to work it all out. I know, Larry Nemeczek has his amazing stellar cartography, and people have gone into a lot of detail on the maps and all these sorts of things. But there is something almost slightly magical about it, I think. Just as you say, the mycelial network is taking that even further and saying you can basically jump from one place to another, kind of as if by magic. But I think there is a sort of feeling again that Captain Nemo also has access to this sort of magical space-time. I suppose that's what it's about, is like, the relationship between time and space, which obviously in the, ancient age of, nautical exploration and so on, ships at sea was quite extreme, in that journeys could take weeks, months, you could be very cut off potentially. Whereas in Star Trek, the feeling is generally that you're not cut off to that extent. Voyager obviously is more cut off because they've gone further than anyone's been before. They've gone way out of their sort of normal sphere. Discovery, again, I suppose in season 3 has sort of reintroduced that with this idea that, okay, dilithium's gone, subspace communication isn't working properly. So they've kind of reverted to this earlier sort of pre-Star Trek model of, what it means to be out at sea or out in space somehow, and to be cut off and to be, isolated, in a way that maybe is more realistic to our own situation in the universe, where, if we can get to Mars, that's going to be a massive big deal and going to take years and years. And the rest of the galaxy is just sort of impossibly, cut off from us for the time being.
Yeah, it is interesting to think of it like that, isn't it? Just like it's one of those things, I suppose, similar to time. If you just stop and think about it, it just would totally drive you kind of mad, isn't it? But I think, like, going back to Enterprise, that when it worked with that kind of nautical submarine feel, you think of like early season 1 episodes where they're laying the transmitters for those communications back to Earth. And, if one of them was destroyed, well, you're kind of goosed, really, aren't you?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Just as much as, if something goes wrong on your submarine and the water comes in, there is a moment actually, which is very much reminding me a little bit of Shuttlepod 1. There's a point in 20,000 Leagues where the Nautilus gets stuck and they're both running out of air and freezing at the same time because they're under the North Pole, the South Pole. I can't remember. I think they go to the South Pole, don't they? Because Captain Nemo wants to stick his flag on the South Pole. So they have this sort of moment of, they're running out of air and they're running out of heat and everything. I mean, there are obviously a lot of parallels, I think, between these sort of submarine stories and these kind of space stories. There's a reason they're a good fit. And that as much as Paris seems to be interested in, nautical literature more generally, as indeed are many characters in Star Trek. I mean, we see, Jake Sisko reading, Horatio Hornblower novels, for example. You know, lots of characters express an interest in that kind of age of those sailing ships. But that this story, this sort of proto-submarine story, this kind of early, I suppose it's a kind of early sci-fi story as well, is the one that really underpins this Voyager episode. And it's a great story. You know, it's a great book. I mean, I don't know about you, the Disney film, I sort of feel the production design is fantastic. Some of the effects are not bad for the time. It's a bit, it for me, it doesn't quite work. I sort of feel if there's any of the Disney back catalogue that could do with a remake for Disney Plus or whatever, that would be one that I would be putting on the list, I think. I don't know about you. I mean, obviously
it'll happen. Like, film, you know the rate they're going through these things. But there'll be a prequel first.
Yeah. Well, it could be fun, I think. In the meantime, there is, I listened to on Audible, a sort of radio drama type adaptation of this story, which is actually written by the guy who, you know, Destination Star Trek, the guy who's the sort of master of ceremonies, Tony Lee. He is also a script writer and comic writer, I think, and he adapted it, and it's quite a good. I'd say it's quite a free adaptation in some ways, in that he drops in incidents that I certainly don't remember being in the novel. But I think it's quite good. It's quite, you know, it's good fun. If you're interested in a sort of radio drama version of this story, it's worth checking out.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Yeah.
Well, Lee, it's been a pleasure as always, diving down to the depths of the ocean with you, checking out the abyss and what might lurk down there with Captain Nemo. But before we go, why don't you let our listeners know where they can contact you if they want to get in touch with you online, and what else you've been up to recently?
Yeah, you can find me on my podcast, The Filibuster, which we sometimes have Star Trek guests on. You've been a guest on a few times as well, Duncan. Mm-hmm. And the A24 Project, where we interview people about indie filmmaking and movies as well. And you can find me on Twitter at Star Trek VHS and at @LeeHutchison_.
You're blended, all right.